We now move on to the next debate. If everyone could leave quietly, please. Mr. Mark Spencer to move the motion. Mr. Spencer, if I could just ask for some indication. We only have one person down to speak, and this is an hour's debate. Is there anyone else wishing to speak who'd like to go on the list? If you could just make that known to the clerk.
Keith Stewart, Steve McCabe.
Mr. Knight, we have Mr. Knight on the list.
Keith Stewart, Richard Burton,
Steve McCabe.
Steve McCabe.
There's three. Okay, so yeah, I won't impose a time limit, and I'm sure that you will, Mr. McCabe. I'm not going to impose a time limit, but I'm sure you'll keep your speeches and you can work the times out for yourself. Okay, Mr. Mark Spencer to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Storries. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I beg to move that the House has considered BBC investment in the East and West Midlands. The East and West Midlands has a proud history of broadcasting, and when you look back through time, we were actually the first regional TV station was established in Sutton Coldfield in 1949. We were also the first to have a regional radio station, which was established in Birmingham in 1922, and the first ever colour TV studio was also established in Birmingham in 1969. I think, of course, I give way to honourable gentleman.
It's not just broadcasting on which Birmingham and the West Midlands leads the way. The West Midlands is, of course, the centre of Britain's creative talents. William Shakespeare, Jerome, K. Jerome, J.R. Tolkien, all of whom are from the West Midlands. And isn't it a complete disgrace that whilst the West Midlands contributes 25% of the licence fee, the BBC spends just 2% of its budget fostering creative talent in the region?
Absolutely, and thank you very much for that intervention. I think this is the crux of this whole debate, frankly. And of course, I give way.
Just to speak briefly on behalf of the East Midlands, there. He missed out the fact that the BBC Asian network was created in Leicester, and under current proposals, they are moving it from Leicester down to London, which is totally unacceptable.
Very good point.
Once again, I'm grateful for that intervention. I think it's quite clear from the mood in the room that we're very proud of both the East and the West Midlands, and it's a shame that the BBC management in London doesn't recognise the importance of the Midlands in terms of its broadcasting ability. As our colleague indicated, 25%, over a quarter of all the licence fee money collected is collected from the Midlands. But when it comes to investment, it's as low as 2.05%. Now, that's an outrageous figure. When you compare that, it's actually a sixth of the amount spent in the north, 21% of that's spent in the south, and less than the broadcaster spends in London in a total of 12 days.
Will my honourable friend...
I give way to honourable gentleman.
I'm most grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. I, of course, have served as a Member of Parliament in the East Midlands as well as in the West Midlands, so I hope I take a balanced approach to the excellent speech which he is delivering. Does he agree with me that it's astonishing that the BBC should neglect in its investment Britain's second city of Birmingham, a centre of the creative arts, as well as the point made by the honourable gentleman earlier? And that actually the BBC is cutting off its nose to spite its face. It's missing out on this huge range of talent.
Speech, a question maybe?
In the East and particularly in the West Midlands.
I'm once again very grateful for that intervention. I think many of us will remember the great facility that was at Pebble Mill, which closed in 2004. And it was the only, currently the Midlands has no network TV studios at all. And if you compare that to the North actually has dozens in comparison. I think, once again, it demonstrates that the BBC doesn't invest in the Midlands, doesn't take us seriously. I give way to the honourable gentleman first.
Can I first of all congratulate the honourable member for securing this debate. Birmingham is not just the city of Chamberlain, it is the city of Pebble Mill. And does the honourable member agree with me that it's absolutely wrong that 9 out of every £10 raised from the Birmingham licence fee payer is not spent in the Midlands? And will you also join with me in congratulating the Birmingham Post and Mail for their outstanding advocacy in support of a fair share for Birmingham and the Midlands?
Spencer.
I absolutely join him in congratulating the Birmingham Post, and certainly it's been a long-running campaign. I also pay tribute to the Honourable Member for Solihull, who's been very active since his election to this House in pursuing this issue, and I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman giving way. Coming back to the point my Honourable friend made from Dudley, I mean, there's a lot of history in the West Midlands for a start, particularly in Coventry, where the Italian job was actually made, and the BBC, if film producers can do it in the Midlands, why can't the BBC, when it's disposing its resources? And equally, we've got to say that the West Midlands is also, you might call, the economic powerhouse of this country, and yet it's ignored, totally ignored by the BBC.
Absolutely.
Mr.
I
Spencer.
totally agree with the Honourable Gentleman. I think when you consider what the East and West Midlands has to offer in terms of backdrops to TV making programmes, you know, the beautiful city of Lincoln, the Sherwood Forest in my own constituency, you know, the great creative talents of Birmingham and of Coventry, the spectacular restaurants in Leicestershire, and of course the rolling hills of Derbyshire. I'm not familiar with what Stoke has to offer, but I'm sure the Honourable Gentleman will educate me. I give way.
Thank you, Mrs. Doris. I won't try your patience by giving a great long list of the marvellous things of North Staffordshire and Stoke-on-Trent in particular. But to make the point, the very serious point, that actually Birmingham and large conurbations like that are hard done to. Actually, there are far-flung places within the West Midlands and East Midlands, like, for example, Stoke-on-Trent, that are even more neglected than places like Birmingham.
And I wholly acknowledge that. And I think, you know, that hopefully this debate will assist the BBC management in understanding their poor decision-making process. I think it's just worth making these comparisons as well on a per-head basis, because if you take it sort of per fee payer, spending was the same as the North and the South. If it was the same, we'd actually get £473 million spent in the Midlands. I give way.
And for giving way again, the really important point he's making about expenditure on broadcasting was brought home to me by my constituent Jean Vincent and her children, who all work in the creative industries, and having to travel further and further away from Dudley to find work. And what she told me is that it's estimated that for every pound the BBC spends, £2 is generated in the wider economy. And that makes BBC investment even more important and means our creative industries in the Midlands are losing out on hundreds of millions of pounds. Is that a point that he'd agree with?
I wholly agree. So if you pursue that argument as the Honourable Gentleman does, if actually for every pound they spend it creates £2 in the local economy, then actually the economy of the East and West Midlands would benefit by £786 million. That's a substantial amount of investment in the economy. So when you compare that by comparison to the Midlands spends £12.40 per head gets spent in the Midlands. If you compare that to Wales, it's £122.24 in Wales, £103.14 in Northern Ireland, £88.73 in Scotland, £80.24 in the north, and in London a staggering £757.24. Now, I think that by any stretch of the imagination leaves us as the poor relations in terms of BBC investment. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Andrew Bridgen.
I commend my honourable friend for Sherwood for securing this debate. Does he agree with me that one of the fundamental problems is that given the current funding mechanism by licence fee of the BBC backed up by criminal sanctions for non-payment, it means that the Midlands licence fee payers have very little influence over the BBC's spending strategy. However, if the BBC were moved to a voluntary subscription mechanism for funding, this would give the subscribers in the Midlands a lot more power and something the BBC could not ignore in their spending strategy.
I'm grateful for his intervention. He has a long-standing record of being supportive of the BBC and a critical friend. I think the licence fee and the subscription service is a separate debate and probably one for another occasion. What I would say is if you compare to where we were a while ago, and you could make the argument maybe that we've always been the poor relations, but actually that's not true, because since 2009 we've seen a 35.25% fall in spending in the Midlands. We've actually fell well below what is spent in London. London actually fell by 16.5% in the same period, but actually investment in the north rose by 217%. Every other region has seen increased investment apart from the Midlands. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
As being very generous, and I'm sure him and other East Midlands MPs would join with me in bidding farewell to John Hess, the BBC political editor in the East Midlands, and wish him well. But I raise that to make a serious point. Does he agree with me that the BBC should continue to invest in good political journalism, explaining to our constituents what is going on in this place, and we wouldn't want to see any of that put back in the future
Mr.
months?
Mark Spencer.
I absolutely agree with the Honourable Gentleman. I think not only John Hess, the very esteemed broadcaster in East Midlands TV, but also across the whole of the Midlands, we've got very good journalists that hold the politicians to account like us, and actually do that very efficiently. So the amount of money spent within the Midlands is very low, but the quality of those programmes is often very high. Now, that's an argument to me for the BBC to invest more in that efficient model and in a system which actually is delivering more bang for its buck. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
On that point, I would just simply draw the committee, and indeed anybody listening or reading about this debate afterwards, attention to Marvellous, the story of Nello, which is a perfect example of fantastic quality production by the BBC. If only we could have more.
Mark Spencer.
I'm grateful for him drawing attention to that issue. So the amount that the BBC spends on its broadcasting house headquarters in London every year is actually £89 million. That's more than it spends on the entire Midlands region on that one centre. I think, as already been identified, none of the output for Radio 1, Radio 2, Radio 3, Radio 5, BBC 2, BBC 3 or BBC 4 was made in the Midlands last year, and there are no peak time BBC programmes whatsoever made in the Midlands. The Midlands has no network TV studios after the closure of Pebble Mill in 2004, and as I've already mentioned, in the north they have dozens. BBC regional spending is up by 35%. Every region has seen an increase in spending over the last 5 years, except for the Midlands. And when you consider that, we are pouring in more than a quarter of licence fee money to get our 2% return. I think this is an outrage. Now, I think I give way to the Honourable Lady.
Thank you for giving way and for this brilliant speech. Has he found in his constituency, though, as I have in mind, that my constituents are supportive of the BBC, but actually as an institution, but what they're opposed to is the total unfairness that we're seeing in the Midlands?
Absolutely, I wholly agree with her. I think the BBC, when it gets it right in terms of programming, my constituents certainly respect and love what they do. My argument is not with what they are doing, it's actually that they should be doing more. They should be investing more in, frankly, a model which is very good, very robust, and actually deserves more investment and more support from those within London. I'm conscious that many other colleagues want to speak, so I'll draw my comments to a close. But just turning to the Minister, I recognise that the Minister's power to influence what the BBC does with its budget is very small, but I hope when he meets them on a regular basis that he'll draw their attention to the investment in the Midlands and the fact that we are the poor relations when it looks at other regions. And I hope he can use the influence that he does have to talk to his colleagues within the BBC and draw their attention to this fact. And I know that other colleagues within the House will continue to draw the attention of BBC managers to this issue. And hopefully, at some point, they'll listen and we can make some progress and get some real investment in the Midlands so we can move forward. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered BBC investment in the East and West Midlands. Julian Knight.
Thank you, Mr. Doris. And I wish to pay testament to my honourable friend for Sherwood in securing this debate. He's a strong advocate for his constituency and for the Midlands as a whole. I must declare an interest at this point in the fact that I actually worked at the BBC from 2007 to 2007, where I was the BBC News Personal Finance and Consumer Affairs reporter, based, hasten to add, in London. The question is for is the BBC investment in the East and West Midlands. The truth is there is far too little of it in the East and West Midlands. In 2014, for each £145.50 of licence fee raised in the West Midlands, just £12.40 came back to the region. And as pointed out before, that compares to a quite staggering £757 in London. There's also what's known by economists as a multiplier effect, whereby which every pound spent multiplies through the economy, through people employed, and for that reason it has a huge and massive and disproportionate impact in London and Manchester rather than Birmingham, the heart of our country, and also the only part of the country that has a trade surplus with the EU, a strong powerhouse that is underrepresented by the BBC, a national broadcaster. I give away.
I'm grateful to the London gentleman. Just a mischievous thought crept into my mind that if every licence fee payer in the Midlands, East and West, paid £12.50, I think the BBC might start to take some notice.
It's Julian Knight.
Yes. Well, obviously, I would never countenance mass civil disobedience over this matter, but it's certainly something probably that may be shared through social media later, as there are a lot of people very interested in this debate. And as I'm following now on my iPad, there is also the live blog going by the Trinity Mayor of the Birmingham Post looking into this. So maybe that's something that will spread around. Of course.
Like I do, that the central problem facing the West Midlands is our inability over decades to have attracted new jobs in new industries to replace the ones that we've lost in traditional industries. And clearly the creative industries are going to generate hundreds of thousands of well-paid jobs over the future. And would he agree with me that the West Midlands, all of us on both sides of the House and in the wider economy in the West Midlands, should make a priority to establish some sort of broadcasting hub in Birmingham and the West Midlands to attract those jobs, get our universities working on this, get the BBC working on this to attract those jobs to the West Midlands for the future?
Oh, yes, certainly a very interesting idea, and I'd actually hope that the BBC would play its role in this if it actually does its job properly in that regard. I mean, it's quite ridiculous, isn't it? The mailbox seems to be full of the HR department rather than people actually making programming for our enjoyment. And if it was to do its job, as I say, properly and be genuinely representative of the strength of the West and the East Midlands, it would be a fact that we would see far greater programming and a real hub, this broadcast hub that we're talking about. Now, I just want to wonder how on earth we got into this situation where we've ended up what I would term a bipolar organisation in the BBC between London and Manchester, a carve-up, if you like. I think we can go back to the last time that the charter renewal came in. It was sadly after the demise of Dr. David Kelly. And we knew then we had the Hutton Report and we had all the goings-on around that and the falling out between the then government and the BBC. The then DG, Mark Thompson, decided, as I say, to do a sort of what I call a Jim Hacker moment, which was when he decided, as in the Yes Prime Minister and Yes Minister programme, that suddenly the idea was to move lots of people from one part of the country to another and call that regional diversity. It was sold to the then government in good faith as extending regional programming and also creating a new hub in Manchester. Now, looking at the output these days of the BBC, I do question what exactly was the purpose of moving thousands of staff to Salford from West London and have them produce the same programming just in a different studio. There is no regional character to the BBC. When I was growing up in Chester and the West Midlands, in Biddulph to be precise, we used to enjoy a lot of regionality in our programme. There were specific programmes to our region, much more than now, and there would also be outside broadcasts, many more outside broadcasts than there are today, and there would be studios established throughout the East and the West Midlands. Many of those have now gone, and we're just left basically with very, very skeleton staff in our region.
I'm very grateful. In that context, would you also question the BBC's figures at the moment that they say more than 50% of their output is produced outside London, but all they've done is increase regional commuting.
Yes.
So people are travelling from London to
Yeah.
the various hubs across the nation, and it hasn't really changed anything.
Julian Knight.
I think the Honourable Lady has that spot on, to be frank with you. I think that the BBC has created, as I say, a bipolar organisation, just transported people from London to Manchester. There's no real regional diversity to its broadcasts. And I'm horrified to learn about the BBC Asian network being moved from Leicester to London. That's a prime example of that in that respect. And I think that I commend the campaign by Trinity Mirror and the Birmingham Post and the journalist Graham Brown in particular on this. I think he's highlighting a very important matter and one that's brought many parties together in this respect. I do think as well that we are in a bit of a sort of dead zone for the national broadcaster in the West Midlands and the East Midlands. I think that we are, it's seen perhaps regional diversity as a little bit too, something to be endured rather than embraced. And I would argue very strongly that if the BBC is to reconnect with the public in a time of mass digital communication, and at a time when we have many different options in order to view and listen to our content, it really should consider drilling right down into the regions and actually offering something that is more regionally based.
My honourable friend for giving way. But is he as horrified as I am that whenever the BBC's income stream is considered to be under threat, the first thing they say they'll have to cut is regional radio? Yes. In the East and West Midlands, that would further reduce the small presence that the BBC already has. And isn't that something that the Minister should take to the BBC and say will be completely unacceptable at Charter Review? Yeah.
I think my honourable friend makes a very good point again in that respect, in that it does seem to be, as I say, that regional broadcast is something to be enjoyed. It's seen as an expense, rather than something that could actually really deliver value for the viewers and listeners, and would be really valued and reconnect once again the BBC to the wider public. Because, you know, we are, many of us here, of a certain age, and we can remember the time of mass broadcast, the Morecambe and Wise shows and 20 million viewers. If you ask that and say that to many younger people these days, under the age of 25, they just won't get that. They just won't understand that connection that many of us have with the BBC. And if the BBC is going to survive in the long term, it needs to understand that it must reconnect with the public. One of the key measures of doing, or ways in which to do that, I believe, is by greater regional broadcast and developing regional talent in that respect. So I would say I would appeal to BBC management to consider the case for the Midlands and to redress the balance, and at the next Charter renewal to genuinely embrace regional diversity, not as some sort of sop, in order basically to buy themselves another 7 years, which is what happened last time. We need to see something that does not just involve this bipolar organisation, but actually takes it out to individuals. And I'm not that encouraged of what I've been hearing so far from the BBC. It does seem to be that they're on their agenda for the Charter renewal, we seem to be having a crackdown on the content on digital devices and not paying the licence fee, retention of criminal sanctions against non-payers, and finally, potentially, inflation in the licence fee. I think that all those things, the BBC needs to get something and understand that the antechamber, I believe, for the end of the licence fee is we're there, and that we need to see a path out of the licence fee over the long term, and that the ways in which that it can reconnect and the ways in which it can offer better value for what it delivers is by focusing on its core services. And I would argue very strongly that its core service is about regional broadcast and about delivering for the people of the East and West Midlands.
Gisa Stewart.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Doris. I need to declare a very narrow interest, and that is that my moment of glory was when Pat Archer was heard to say on May the 7th in 1997 from Pebble Mill, which was in my constituency, that of course when we won Edgbaston we'd know we'd have a Labour government. So I was very disappointed when they moved out of Pebble Mill and I was no longer the MP for the Archers. But I'm now going to have to do something which may sound slightly counterintuitive and partly defend the BBC, because we've got to be careful here what we wish for. If we want a public service broadcaster, which is for most of the rest of the world, they would give their eye teeth for the BBC and the World Service, then our desire to have that has consequences. Now, that doesn't mean that I agree with everything the BBC has done, but I do think the government does not get off scot-free from that decision. If we wish the BBC to be a public service broadcaster that can survive in the modern age, then I think that funding structure and the stream has to be protected as well. And what it means for the Midlands is quite significant. Now, first of all, we have to acknowledge that Tony Hall, when he saw those empty offices in the mailbox, was horrified. And they have tried to fill those empty offices. So far, only with HR staff. They've moved their academy there, but at least they're moving that way. They have appointed a regional director. However, for me, the bottom line is, if we don't start commissioning programs from the Midlands, nothing will flow from that. We may become a production area, but for the West Midlands to actually reflect its own culture and its output, we have to commission programs in the Midlands and have commissioners there. And we see that on a daily basis. You turn on Women's Hour and they will have Fox Pop and they go to Manchester and Oxford Road. They're not in the bullring asking people. The whole culture is just the wrong way. So what that means for us, I think, as MPs in the region, we have to stress a number of things. If the BBC wants to survive in the future, we are the future. 40% of Birmingham's population is under the age of 25. 30% is under the age of 15. The ethnic diversity in that region of a stable population is enormous. It is not just the Asian network, which started 40 years ago in the Midlands. It is the whole cultural production which is happening there. And quite frankly, if the BBC does not reflect the culture of that significant area, of the chunk in the middle of England, which is so easy to overlook, and it seems to be overlooked, then the BBC as a public service broadcaster will actually not fulfill its function for the whole of the country. And therefore, what I would say to colleagues, yes, we have to keep up the pressure and say to the BBC, you step by step trying to move in the right direction, you aren't there yet. I would also say to colleagues, we've got to be clear about if we do away with the licence fee, that too will have consequences. And just think for a moment, for those of us who actually think the Union, the United Kingdom, is important, the British Broadcasting Corporation is one of the very few British institutions that still embraces the entire British Isles and the nation. So we should just... Certainly.
Just on that point, where you said it embraces. However, we did note during the referendum campaign that the Scottish National Party was very angry with the BBC and claiming bias in that respect. So I'm just wondering whether or not the modern BBC, by the fact that it doesn't embrace regional broadcast in the way in which we're discussing today, means that it is not fulfilling that true national broadcaster remit.
That is a really important point for us to pause. The SNP would like a national broadcaster. I'd like a public sector broadcaster. And there is a very, very important distinction which we must not lose. And this is why I think the BBC, if it does not fulfill its duty to the regions, and whether that reflects itself in terms of the political output in radio broadcasting, which is neglecting. And let's be clear, what happens in the Midlands is extremely important for Northern Wales, because the Northern Wales looks to the output from the Midlands more than it does to South of Wales. So to be a proper public sector broadcaster, it has to represent the regions. It has to be more than just the national one, but it needs to commission the programmes in the regions as well. So the challenge for us is to be clear for the ask to the BBC. The challenge to the BBC is, unless they start commissioning programmes in the whole of the Midlands, they will not reflect us. And that takes us back to the challenge for the Charter Review to the government, that if they want a public sector broadcaster, that requires certain funding streams which will allow the BBC to fulfil that function.
Mr. McCabe.
Thank you, Ms Doris. Can I congratulate the honourable gentleman for Sherwood for securing this important debate. He and I have constituencies at opposite ends in the Midlands, but I think what we have in common is a sense of injustice about the poor return our licence fee payers get on the investment they make. And what I think we need from the BBC is quite simple. we need a fairer share of the spend and a much firmer commitment that BBC production will be brought to our region. For far too many of my constituents, and I suspect people across the Midlands, the BBC means London, Cardiff, Salford, Bristol, Belfast, Glasgow, the Big Six, anywhere but our region. And it seems to me that the simple fact remains, various people have quoted the figures, the reality is the Midland licence fee payer contributes about 942 million to the BBC, and it gets about 80 million back in terms of investment, less than 9% of the total licence fee. I don't think anyone could see that as fair.
BBC spent £1 billion on new broadcasting house and also wasted or wrote off £100 million on a failed digitisation project last year.
Thank you. Well, I mean, I think we can all have criticisms of failures in spending, but the central point I'm making is about the inequitable spend here, but I take the honourable gentleman's point. In a brief, Ms Doris, the BBC sent me for this debate. I was reminded that the mailbox is the home of the academy, the workplace, outreach. Great, but what the brief didn't contain was the numbers of new jobs and apprenticeships associated with these initiatives. And what I'd really like to know is how it compares to the 180 million new studio and the 1,000 new jobs for Media City in Salford. And I'd really like to know, as my honourable friend pointed out, why the bulk of production is technically still located in London. Now, I'm told that the BBC is anxious to use Birmingham as an innovative testbed because, as we've heard, we've got the youngest city in Europe. We've got a truly multi-ethnic and multicultural area. But what I want to know is, where's the substance to this? Where are the new formats, the new technologies, the new jobs that are actually coming to the Midlands? I think it's time we saw some of the hard data, and I want to know that all these promises are coming true, that there is a plan to work with the Ormiston Academy, the REP and Birmingham City University. I've heard plenty of the talk. I think it's time we saw some of the action, and we need to know that there's a real programme for mentoring and apprenticeships in the Midlands, and we need to know that digital innovation is more than just a form of words. Now, obviously, I will give way.
Just touching on the apprenticeships, but I'd also wonder whether anyone has any thoughts in terms of pay differentials within the BBC. There's 91, by latest reports, members of BBC staff on more than the Prime Minister currently employed, while many people who actually do the programming, the broadcast assistants, broadcast journalists and senior broadcast journalists, may take home a quarter of that sort of salary, yet they are the ones putting in the work, while those who are moving people from place to place are earning bumper salaries. I wonder what the honourable gentleman thinks about that.
Mr McCabe.
Yeah, well, I think that's a real challenge for the Director-General. I think it's one of the things he's got to tackle. It contributes to this sense of unfairness that many of us have about the organisation. And of course, I welcome, like my honourable friend, the news that HR jobs and training jobs are coming to Birmingham. But, you know, it was only a couple of years back that the BBC announced a nationwide search for new talent for disabled presenters, and it managed to entirely exclude Birmingham from the process. So I want to know, where's the new jobs for the performers in the Midlands, for the directors, for the creative people in the Midlands? So I want to conclude by congratulating the honourable member for securing this debate. And I think what we need to hear is that any future discussion on charter renewal and the licence fee will be about a more equitable share of the money. You can't contribute nearly £1 billion to the BBC pot and get a paltry 9% back. It must be obvious that Midland licence fee payers... I'll give.
Sorry to intervene on him, but just to recognise, when we are given the opportunity in the East and West Midlands, like with Notts TV, which has been created, which has been a really successful model working alongside Nottingham Trent University, when we're given the opportunity, we're actually really good at it. And it's such a shame that those in London don't recognise that talent and don't invest more in it.
Ms McKay.
I totally agree. I think there's a wealth of creative talent across the Midlands, and as somebody said earlier in the debate, we keep hearing about this desire to help the regions to grow and to rebalance their economies. Well, one of the things we need to do is to recognise that creative potential in our region. And apart from anything else, I've come to the conclusion, and I say this to the Minister, I don't know how helpful it will be, but the Midland licence fee payers aren't going to tolerate this any longer. The game is up. They've had enough.
Mr Burton. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Mrs Doris. And can I add my congratulations to the Honourable Member for Sherwood? And I think the Minister will have understood that the feeling on this issue across both East and West Midlands runs very deep, and it's cross-party, and it's something that isn't going to go away. And I think in terms of looking ahead to charter renewal, it is absolutely vital that in the negotiations the government has on that the question of regional broadcasting is something that has got to happen as a reality, not something that is simply written in the right words, in the right documents. And I think the government has got a role to play in pushing the BBC quite hard on that in the coming period. Now, honourable members have talked about the figures, and they are stark, about the contribution that licence fee payers in the East and West Midlands pay towards the BBC and what comes back to the region. And many of us feel that we've been around this track so many times before, particularly my uncle friend for Birmingham Selly Oak, my uncle friend for Edgeworthstown and I've kind of lost count of the amount of meetings that we've been to. I can just about count up the numbers of Director Generals and acting Director Generals that we have put these points to. And each of them has come back and said they agree. Would have been a bit easier maybe if one of them had come back and said, actually, no, you're wrong. You know, we think that actually the East and West Midlands are a bit of a backwater. That isn't where the action is, that we need to do what we're doing. But every time they told us, they agreed with us. And every time they told us it was going to change. Now, in the early phases of that, I have to say, I don't think it was entirely the BBC's fault. In the early phases, when Mark Thompson was Director General, there was a memorandum of understanding agreed between the BBC and Birmingham City Council. I have to say the lack of ambition to put that into practice at that time, I think, was in pretty equal measure between the City Council and the BBC. The words are all there. But when we asked afterwards what was being done to follow it up, actually there wasn't much going on at all. Yes, indeed.
Very grateful. I think if I recount the moment correctly, it was quite obvious that neither the leader of the City Council nor Mark Thompson had actually read the Memorandum of Understanding and couldn't tell us what was in it.
Richard Burton.
As somebody I think was meant to have said in this place, the Honourable Lady may say that, I couldn't possibly comment. Which I will comment, she's right. She's absolutely right on that. So then there was another couple of Directors General, and each time they said that things were going to change. Now, my honourable friend for Edgeworthstown is right in relation to Tony Hall, I think. When we go back to October 2013, there was a cross-party group of Midlands MPs that presented a petition that had been put together by the Campaign for Regional Broadcasting. Now, I just want to pay tribute to them, by the way, in terms of keeping this issue in the public eye and getting up there in lights the inequity in the funding figures. But I think it was significant that in November 2013, the BBC did commit to a new vision for Birmingham and the Midlands as a whole, this pledge of 23.5 million investment, and Birmingham to become a new centre of digital excellence for skills, recruitment and talent, and creating hundreds of jobs there. I think that was a change because there was actually some action taken. I have to believe that Tony Hall is probably serious about that. But I'm just kind of worried that having made that announcement, it's kind of grinding to a halt again. And when my honourable friend for Birmingham Selly Oak mentioned the briefing we've had from the BBC here, you know, it is saying it's okay, we're doing it. It runs through the kinds of things we've been told before, the kinds of programmes that were either made some time ago. And it just says at the end, the BBC is committed to providing audiences with programmes and services that reflect the many communities across... Yes, indeed.
Similar documentation as well. And it seems to be always with the BBC, and I hope my honourable member will agree with me, that it always seems to be a case of jam tomorrow for the Midlands, rather than we want our jam today or at least in time for the next charter renewal.
Yeah, I think the honourable gentleman is right, and at the risk of mixing metaphors too much about jams and glue, what we need, I think, in order for the ambition that Tony Hall says he's got for the BBC in Birmingham, the kind of thing that we are all talking about to happen, it needs some glue to stick it together. It needs something behind it that makes it happen. And I think my honourable friend for Edgbaston hit the nail on the head, and I think my honourable friend Selly Oak made the point as well, that glue, crucial to that, is commissioning. Because, you know, the BBC, we all talk about the BBC network, and what everybody that I've spoken to inside the BBC and beyond in related creative industries have said is that networking is absolutely vital to this happening. People have got to know each other. When they commission a programme, they need names come into their minds about who it is they're going to approach, which production companies they're going to use, where they're going to get their new talent from. And if that focus remains in London, then you won't get change in Birmingham and the East and West Midlands. And the kind of change you get, and the Honourable from Solihull had this absolutely right, the kind of change you get in the north is actually not a real change, that you do get this commuting. So what we need is a commitment by the BBC to match its ambitions for the network by getting real networking taking place, looking out the new talent and the existing talent that is there in our regions, but particularly the East and West Midlands to go forward. And if you can do that, that can pull behind it the apprenticeships, that can pull behind it the training that can make these things fly. So I think, you know, the time has come. I, you know, absolutely endorse the fact that as far as the current Director General, I too have noticed a change from what has gone before. But I hope that when he reads the transcript of this debate, he will understand that we want to be friends on this. But for us to remain friends on it, the action has got to follow the words. And that means that if we are going to be the centre of broadcasting in the future, are going to be that centre for digital broadcasting in the future, which in many ways is going to be the future, he's got to be doing more than is currently done to make that happen. And that means a vision beyond the HR-related and training jobs that are being brought to the Midlands at the moment. And it crucially means a focus on commissioning, a focus on production, and a focus on getting the networks in place that can make the BBC and the East and West Midlands vital parts of the BBC's ambition for the future.
Mr. Argyle.
Thank you, Ms Dorries, and it's a pleasure to speak in this debate under your chairmanship. And I congratulate my honourable friend for Sherwood on securing such an important debate and for drawing attention to the appallingly inequitable funding allocated by the BBC to our region. I'll endeavour to be brief, not least because, as ever, my honourable friend has set out the issue so well with his usual clarity. And I have to say that on being elected to this House and making my first contribution today to a debate in this hall, Ms Dorries, I never expected to find myself so fully in agreement with the honourable member for Birmingham Selly Oak as I do. The proud tradition of broadcasting in the East Midlands, highlighted by my honourable friend, as by the Right Honourable Member for Leicester East, extends to Leicestershire too. For example, BBC Radio Leicester does a first-class job of serving the people of Leicester and Leicestershire. But that organisations like BBC Radio Leicester continue to be trusted and listened to in such numbers by my constituents is in large part down to the talent and hard work of those journalists and broadcasters, not, it would appear, down to their receiving fair levels of investment from the BBC, which, as we have heard, is certainly not reflective of the amount of licence fee paid by our region.
Of course.
Thank
my honourable friend for giving way. But I'd like to make sure the Chamber's fully aware of the size of the organisation that is the BBC. If you include BBC Worldwide in the BBC revenue stream, it's an organisation of about £5 billion a year. That's comparable with the United Nations and twice the budget of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office annually.
My honourable friend makes an extremely important point with force and clarity, as always. My constituents have no choice about paying their licence fee, and while on this occasion I won't labour my view that non-payment should be decriminalised, the least they should be able to expect is a fair deal and a fair share from what they pay. I hope that as we look towards charter renewal, such issues as the BBC's spending bias against the Midlands will feature in that debate. I would fully endorse the points made by the honourable gentleman for Leicester South in respect of local political journalism in the East Midlands and its importance to our democracy, and to all of us being held to account by local journalists producing local content. 25% contributed, 2% received. It is disgracefully unfair as an equation, however you look at it, which cannot be allowed to go on. It is time for the BBC to escape its apparent London-centric investment bias and once again fully seize on the talent and energy of the Midlands by investing and producing more in our region. I hope that the Minister will ensure the BBC receives the strength of honourable members' views clearly, particularly in respect of how much we and our constituents value that truly local content. And particularly the points, in concluding, Ms Dorries, the points so well made by my honourable friend, the member for Solihull, in respect of the BBC needing to approach charter renewal, recognising it must continue to change, it must continue to listen to those who listen to it and who have no choice but to pay their licence fee and not simply ask us for more money.
Sean Jones.
Thank you very much, Mrs Dorris, and it's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I'd like to thank the honourable member for Sherwood for securing what I think has been a very passionate and very committed debate. And I was fascinated as he went through the history and the heritage of TV and radio broadcasting in Midlands, East Midlands and West Midlands, of course. And I would like to thank as well all members who've made speeches and interventions in this debate, my honourable friends who have made speeches, members for Birmingham Edgbaston, Birmingham Selly Oak and Birmingham Northfields, and also the honourable members for Solihull and Sherwood, and of course my honourable friend, the member for Stoke-on-Trent South, with his, as ever, very perceptive and incisive interventions into this important debate. And I, of course, would like to pay tribute to the long-time campaigners on this issue. And it's very important, of course, that this campaign has been truly cross-party, having, as it does as well, of course, the support of the new chair of the Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee. And I would also like to pay tribute to the campaigning of the Birmingham Post and Mail on this issue, which I know has been so important in placing it on the national agenda. Now, of course, we're here to discuss BBC investment in the Midlands, and the main investment the BBC makes is, of course, BBC Birmingham. My honourable friend, the member for Birmingham Edgbaston, is quite right. It is something that those of us living in the borders of North East Wales have seen a lot. I've seen a lot of, sometimes by choice, sometimes through transmitter problems, in that we don't always get BBC Wales, which is of course a subject for another day. But of course there's no question that BBC Birmingham has a very proud history, producing Pebble Mill at one and Boys from the Black Stuff. Across the Midlands, there's BBC Midlands Today, BBC East Midlands Today, and BBC Look East. Online content and 14 local radio stations. And BBC Birmingham, as we all know, makes great shows like Doctors, and it's the home of BBC Asian Network, as reference was made earlier. And of course, it produces that great popular radio drama the Archers, though I confess I did not know the Archer. I always thought they were based somewhere in the West Country and not in my honourable friend, the member for Birmingham Edgbaston's constituency. It is, of course, the Archers is, of course, over 65 years old, but its listeners are of all ages and around the world. And I believe since those FM radio waves travel through space, we can confidently say it reaches as far as Pluto. The theme tune of the Archers has even been suggested as an English national anthem. It doesn't quite compare to Hyn Lad Van Hadau, but it is pretty good, and it is an extraordinary international production. But there are clearly very, very serious concerns on this issue. For instance, the cash figures that have been raised. That of a quarter of this area, West and East Midlands, has a quarter of licence fee payers, but 2% of BBC spending. Last year, that meant 249 million to the BBC, but 80 million back. Per head of population, the BBC is investing only £12.40. And these figures, of course, have real consequences in infrastructure and therefore in programming. The BBC has little to no commissioning or production facilities in the Midlands, and no prime-time BBC One programmes are made in the Midlands. In fact, the BBC doesn't make anything on BBC 2, 3 or 4 in the Midlands, nor on radios 1, 2, 3 or 5. A small chunk of investment means a small chunk of infrastructure, which means a small chunk of programming. And in the debate today, at least 3 main problems have been raised with this state of affairs. The first is the simple matter of fairness that's been raised by so many honourable members. I believe my honourable friend, the member for Birmingham Edgbaston, has previously referred to it as a mismatch, and she is absolutely right. One estimate is that the Midlands is paying out 12 times what it gets back. The second problem is to do with the infrastructure of creativity. The BBC is the central part of the United Kingdom's creative and cultural ecosystem, and at a national level, the BBC plays a key role in training and fostering talents, encouraging investment and exports, and raising standards across the market. The £3.5 billion we pay the BBC is our single biggest investment in the arts. And at regional level, the BBC helps ground creative clusters. This can be seen most clearly in the BBC's move to Salford. The Media City UK cluster of creative firms and workers is grounded by the BBC. The investment the BBC makes in the Midlands, particularly in training and digital, helps ground its growing creative scene. More investment would mean a better and more flourishing creative ecosystem. And the third programme is to do with what we see on our screens and here on our radio, as has been discussed earlier, including by the honourable member for Solihull, in terms of diversity and regional content. For this isn't just about wanting more spending, it's about reflecting our country back to itself. And that's why it's important we have stories from every part of this country. In every nook and cranny of the United Kingdom, there's a unique viewpoint and voice that we need to hear in our national conversation. We've been very clear about what we in the Labour Party support. We believe in a BBC for everyone, and that is why we support the existence of the licence fee. For the fundamental principle is that everyone pays in and everyone gets something out. People need to feel they are getting something out, that the BBC is worth it. I accept that not everyone agrees with that, but that is where we as a party stand. Certainly, I'd be delighted.
Would the honourable lady clarify the position of the Labour Party? Are the party in favour or against continued criminalisation for non-payment of the TV licence?
We believe there are major issues to be looked at, but that we believe that needs to happen in this debate and discussion on the BBC Charter. It's not a little opt-out alone. This debate is much too important for that. And we know as well that the BBC has recognised this disparity. When Tony Hall became Director General in 2013, he visited the mailbox and announced additional investment. In particular, the focus on training and digital was a sign of investment in the future of the BBC, as my honourable friend, the member for Birmingham Northfield, spoke of earlier. But the issue itself hasn't gone away. The question is what we do now. On the 19th of March, the Prime Minister was asked about BBC investment in Birmingham and the Midlands, and he said the Charter renewal is a good time to have that conversation, and that these are the questions we will be able to ask in the Charter renewal process, which starts after the election. We agree with the Prime Minister on this. We passed the election and we should be getting on with charter renewal, which is the right time to have this conversation. Charter renewal is our opportunity every decade to ask ourselves, what do we want the BBC to do? We re-examine the BBC's purposes, governance, funding and investment in the round. The Culture Secretary's Select Committee report on the future of the BBC laid out a roadmap for how this would work. This basically means copying the successful model that Tessa Jowell, Labour's Culture Secretary, took us through 10 years ago. That was a vibrant, open, consultative national conversation about the BBC's future, and it's time to do it again. Labour wants an open and transparent national debate to start as soon as possible. We want all the excellent campaigners to be able to make their case in an open, transparent process, so the government needs to get on with it. The last charter renewal process was three years long. In a week, it'll be half that, a year and a half, until the charter runs out. Today, there are only 557 days to go until the charter. And it's worrying that the government seems inactive, saying we'll make an announcement in due course. I don't think there's time. I'd love to, unfortunately, though. And a year and a half isn't very long for an important debate. And out of concern for this, the Culture Secretary's report even floated the option of extending the existing charter for a year. Well, we think this time the government should hand its homework in on time. It shouldn't all be left to the last minute, then bosh something out late at night behind closed doors, exactly what they did in 2010. They certainly shouldn't ask for an extension because the dog ate their draft charter. They need to start the charter renewal process as soon as possible to ensure an open debate. Then we can get on with debating the real issues, like how to ensure a diversity of viewpoints and voices. Labour will be arguing for a BBC that does something for everyone. Everyone pays out of it and everyone gets something into it. The Conservatives, on the other hand, have flirted with a different view, some of which we've even heard today. If not wholesale privatisation, then drastically reducing the range and breadth of BBC's output. If that's the debate, very well, let's get on with it.
Well, thank you very much. May I begin by saying what a pleasure it is to appear under your chairmanship, Mrs. Dorries. I often say that when I appear under a new chairman, but in this case I mean it. And I've obviously been an enormous fan of yours since we came into the House together, and I want to celebrate you as one of Britain's foremost authors. The famous trilogy, the Four Streets trilogy, The Four Streets, Hide Her Name, and the Ballymara Road, published this month. What we see before us is a multi-thousand selling British author, and it perhaps says something about the tone. It says something about the tone of arts coverage in this country, that the chairman we see before us is not as celebrated as some other authors who sell far fewer books. And I thank you, Mrs. Dorries, for allowing me to indulge myself in this way. When I tried to praise Louise Bagshaw when she was an MP, the Speaker slapped me down. But thankfully, we now have a more enlightened chairman here for this debate. May I also praise my honourable friend, the member for Sherwood, for calling this important debate. I have to say it's been a lot more lively than I would have expected. And before I go on to talk about his remarks and the remarks of other members, may I also pay a special tribute to the brilliant journalist Graham Brown of the Birmingham Post and the Birmingham Mail, who has brought this campaign to great prominence and corralled, working with many members in this House this afternoon to really get this campaign onto a critical mass. I have to say I can't really improve on the speech of my honourable friend, the member for Sherwood, in terms of the statistics that he talked about, the hundreds of millions that's spent by people living in the Midlands on the licence fee and the return, in effect, on investment they get from the BBC. But also, I think, a more important point, because one can always play around with statistics, but it is clear from what he said that investment in all the regions has increased, except in the Midlands, falling in the Midlands and falling in London, but that's not really relevant because of London's huge funding already. May I also pay tribute to my honourable friend, the member for Solihull, a rare species indeed, a Conservative in the BBC, and for that he is to be treasured. Part of me wishes he was still in the BBC flying the flag for the Conservative Party, but I have to say, given the speech that he just made here, one would have thought he hadn't worked for the BBC at all, but had been in this House for 25 years. Such was the assured point that he made, and pointing out that there is, as it were, a north-south link between the BBC, missing out the Midlands. But of course, it wasn't a one-sided debate. There were some valuable contributions from, particularly obviously from the Honourable Lady, the member for Birmingham Edgeworthstown, and I share with her a defence of the BBC. We are here as critical friends of the BBC, but we do want to see the BBC thrive. Not only is it a fantastic asset to viewers and listeners in this country, but of course it is one of our most important, if not the most important, calling card we have around the globe. But I want to pick up on a point that she made about why the BBC should have a greater presence in the Midlands, about youth and diversity. Diversity in particular is a passion of mine. We need far more diversity, far more urgently in our media, and the BBC can lead the way, and as she rightly pointed out, with such diverse and young communities in the constituencies represented around in this hall, that is where the BBC should be working. The Honourable Member for Birmingham Selyoak also made the forceful points about the need for the BBC to invest in the Midlands alongside the Honourable Member for Birmingham Northfield. And again, not a debut, but again, so good to see my old friend, now the member for Charnwood, my old personal friend as well as an honourable friend, make such an impassioned speech. And again, only just arrived in this House, but to say that he has found his feet would be the understatement of the century. But what we see also in this hall are members representing some great, fantastic cultural institutions in the Midlands. I wanted to tell the Honourable Member for Dudley how much I've enjoyed my visits to Dudley Zoo, where they have two of the finest tigers I or indeed my children have met. The Honourable Member for Leicester, the Leicester Curve, the Honourable Member for Stoke, of course, the Wedgwood Museum, which he has been so instrumental in helping to save that collection, as well as the thriving, now hopefully even more thriving potteries, and of course Birmingham itself with the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra, the Symphony Hall, the largest library in Europe, and the Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery. All of these honourable members made valuable contributions, emphasised the thriving nature of culture in the Midlands, but also an element of nostalgia for Pebble Mill Studios, which I think points to the direction forward. And also, I think, just to address one specific point made by the Honourable Member for Leicester about the BBC Asian Network, my understanding, and I obviously looked into this the minute the Chairman of the Home Affairs Select Committee brought it up, my understanding is that one programme from the BBC Asian Network is moving to London, but the network is split between Leicester and London, and that will remain the case. Now, we can play, of course.
I'm most grateful to the Minister, and thank him for his kind words a moment or two ago about Wedgwood and indeed the other magnificent potteries that we have in Stoke-on-Trent and North Staffordshire. But just taking the Minister back, he mentioned about Pebble Mill, and much has been talked about with the mailbox. But those members who, over the last few years, have been called down to the mailbox to take part in the Sunday Politics show will have seen a dramatic reduction in the facilities there, and indeed now it's pre-recorded on a Friday, so the savings and changes, not savings in terms of trying to battle the traffic of Birmingham, but compared to a Sunday. But the dumbing down, if I can use that phrase, of what we've seen at the mailbox is quite shocking.
Well, the honourable member is not mincing his words, and indeed I must mention as well the honourable member for Sutton Coldfield, as well as the honourable member for Birmingham Erdington, the honourable member for Coventry South, my honourable friend, the member for North West Leicester, who's been so helpful to the BBC in the last 12 months or so, the honourable member for Redditch, as well as the other members that I've mentioned, have all made incredibly valuable points, and I think also pointing to the concerns of their constituents. Now, we can play fast and loose in politics, and I would not dream, for example, of taking the comments for the honourable member for Stoke-on-Trent South out of context and starting to perhaps say that the Labour Party was advocating a licence fee of £12.50, because I know that's not what he meant. He was simply trying to draw attention to the fact that comparing the contribution of people living in the Midlands to what they receive back. I won't yet take his intervention. I'll make a bit of progress and then see if I've got room for some more interventions. But I just wanted to make a point because I think it plays to the concerns that have been set out in this hall tonight. First of all, the BBC has a strong regional presence in many other parts of the country. If you go to Glasgow, you'll see a fantastic presence of the BBC. Belfast, of course, Cardiff, where they now film Doctor Who. We know about the move to Salford, and we can say whether or not that is a good or a bad thing, but it has happened, and although I hear the point about the BBC making a real move rather than simply a commuting move, London, and of course arguably Bristol, which is the centre of its wildlife programming. But has Birmingham missed out? Well, the BBC would say it is doing what it can. It points, for example, to the fact that it is making the mailbox, referred to earlier by the Honourable Member, as the base for the BBC Academy, as well as the BBC Diversity Unit and Internal Communications, and also that they are increasing jobs there. And I understand investment will go up from £80 million this year to £89 million next year and up to £125 million the year after, and also a training remit with the establishment of the Drama Village in Selly Oak and the Digital Innovation Unit as well. And of course drama itself, such as the highly successful Peaky Blinders, and they've just finished filming Lenny Henry's semi-autobiographical drama Danny and the Zoo, which may indeed take place in my much-loved Dudley Zoo. But the point I think that is being made here today is about much more than that. We obviously should welcome what the BBC is doing in terms of investing in Birmingham and the East and West Midlands, but what I think honourable members are calling for is much greater cultural representation, if I can put it in those words. I'll give way to the honourable lady.
Just one example, a brilliant radio broadcasting series which follows World War I day by day, 15-minute slots. Great, recorded in Birmingham, but not a single storyline involves the Midlands. And that is the point, that production on its own is not sufficient. We need commissioning, which recognises the input of the Midlands.
Well, that is exactly the point. And to a certain extent, where the BBC makes its programmes does matter. It matters either because it starts it effectively acts as an anchor for a creative cluster. So nobody would argue perhaps that Doctor Who reflects Welsh culture, but it would certainly argue that it supports the Welsh creative industries, just as the BBC's investment in S4C does as well. But one would argue perhaps that some programmes being transmitted from different cities do help to reflect the wider cultural aspects of the United Kingdom.
And also, when he's speaking to the BBC about their lack of footprint in the Midlands, ask him not to accept the fact that they've had their licence fee frozen for 5 years. It's not diminished the income stream.
Minister,
yeah, good
1
point.
minute left.
And but basically, I am but a junior minister, and I think that honourable members in this chamber can reflect on the fact that they have the support of the Prime Minister. Already quoted, but I'll quote him again, it never does one any harm. The Charter renewal is a good time to have that conversation and make sure that the West Midlands gets its fair bang for its buck. And the East Midlands, but the quote was the West Midlands, the West and the East Midlands, but that's what he meant to say. As well as the Mayor of London and my honourable friend, the member for Uxbridge as well, and of course the chairman of the Select Committee, who describes himself as a Midlands MP representing Hereford. So there is strong support for this, and we are going to publish before the recess. We will set out what we are going to do in terms of charter review, so I hear what the honourable lady says about getting on with it, and I can guarantee to honourable members in this chamber who have made such a strong case that their case will be reflected in what we set out.
The sitting stands adjourned.